So good evening, everyone, to the community budget listening session for Tigard-Tualatin School District. We just completed our several month-long community budget work group process, and we're headed into convening our formal budget committee later this month. So we wanted to give the broader community an update of where we're at and the status of our budget going into next year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sue Reekie-Smith, our superintendent, for her own welcome.
Thank you so much, David. Patty, could you advance the next slide, please?
Sorry, Lisa, did you want to give any instructions related to interpretation?
Ok, pues bienvenidos a todos, y quiero explicar que si quiere escuchar en español, necesita seleccionar el botón de interpretación o interpretation en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Parece como un globo, y puedes escuchar en español.
Thank you, Lisa. Patty, next slide, please. So it's again my pleasure to welcome all who are joining us via live stream this evening, or who may be just now coming in to the presentation, to this evening's information event relative to our budget and budget process. I especially want to say thank you to our board chair, Maureen Wolf, our board vice chair, Ben Bowman, our directors, Karen Emerson and Director Jill Zerschmeed, for being with us this evening, as well as district staff. This evening, you will get a broad overview relative to the budget process, and then specific information relative to our strategic investments for the coming year, as well as the various funding resources that we will be managing going into the 2021-2022 school year. And with that, Director Moore, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Reekie-Smith. Next slide, please, Patty. So our goals for tonight, to summarize, a lot of this will be review for those of you that were part of the budget work group process, including board members. We will have some updated budget estimates for 21-22 to share this evening, but we wanted to start out by giving an overview of our budget process and what sets the foundation for the district as we make resource allocation decisions. And like I said, we'll share an overview of the general fund resources and budget and other resources that will supplement district needs going into next year. And Director Zinnia Unn will give a review of our SIA process, or student investment account process, and the work to date, and how that work has served as well in meeting some of the impacts of COVID-19. And then Dr. Reekie-Smith will give a high-level overview of a timeline, and we'll share some uses of federal dollars, referred to as the ESSER dollars, and we'll complete the evening by sharing strategic investments that came out of the work group process that Dr. Reekie-Smith alluded to. And I know when I'm speaking, I'll be speaking for extensive amount of time when we're talking about resources. I'll try to pause from time to time to see if there's questions out there, and Director Rose will prompt speakers if there are questions that come up, but we'll also provide for time for questions at the end. Next slide, please, Patty. So I mentioned how we like to anchor in our priorities as we're making budget decisions. And we always like to show this graphic or image where it, on the left side demonstrates how things could operate in a school district like ours, where there's divergent needs and different priorities from various stakeholders. But oftentimes when you have that type of approach, it leads to resources being used that don't always align with our priorities as a district. So we always like to show this to anchor people into what's our foundation and our philosophy as a district when it comes to allocating resources. Next slide, please, Patty. Next slide. So we pay attention to a process referred to as strategic budgeting. And when we're aligning resources to our strategic priorities, we consider these three important factors, including consistently and continually monitoring programs and how they're paying off in the form of academic return on investment, and perhaps those that are become our top objectives. We consider increasing investment in those areas if they're truly making a difference for students. And we also practice finding resources in that program review and evaluation, perhaps repurposing and reallocating resources and aligning the resources with those programs that are making a difference. And then, of course, communicating any of these shifts and in order to win support for these changes. And most importantly, these are always hard decisions, and they require multi-year planning and perhaps up to 3 years, first year of implementation, second year of monitoring, and a third year of evaluation. So it's important to stay the course and pay attention to these best practices so we're making the best decisions for our kids. Next slide, please, Patty. Thank you. So as I mentioned, our budget process, we anchor into and use it as a foundation our strategic priorities. We put this graphic together to emphasize that. You'll see on the left side our four cornerstones of our strategic plan, in addition to our district priorities. And so that sets the framework for our conversations that often happen year-round related to making budgeting decisions and allocating resources. In the fall, after we've taken that recess over the summer, we convene our steering committee. That's an internal committee made up of cabinet members and a board member and staff, finance and assessment staff. And we're continually having conversations around that practice of aligning resources with those key investments, those investments that are making a difference for kids. And then perhaps there's new investments being proposed where we evaluate and do our due diligence before moving forward with implementation. And then I mentioned earlier that community budget work group process. That's a multi-month process, typically begins in January, February, goes through April. And we just completed that process this year. And we bring forth proposals to that work group related to potential investments. And then we also give updates to the work group in past strategic investments that have been implemented and how those investments are making a difference, or maybe they've stalled out in certain areas. But it's to involve the community, getting back to that community engagement piece, and getting input on moving forward with any proposals or current strategic investments. Right now, we're in that frame, that the part of the framework where we're cabinet and the finance team have taken the input and feedback from the work group, and we're putting together the framework for that proposed budget, which will be presented to that formal budget committee in May. That's the lavender section there of the graphic. And the budget committee is responsible for listening to public comment related to the proposed budget. And also in the end, they approve not only the budget, but the tax levies that have to be submitted to the county for the 21-22 school year. And then in the end, the board in June considers the approved budget and also holds a public hearing to hear public comment, and is the final adopter of the budget document for the 21-22 school year. I'm going to pause for a minute to make sure there's no questions at this point as we conclude our part of the presentation around budget process.
No questions at this time, David.
Thank you, Director Rose. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we just are completing our steps with cabinet team and the finance team with our framework for the general fund budget for next year. We have an estimated budget in the form of expenditures of $162 million that we expect to propose for 21-22. And just a reminder for everyone, the general fund is basically consists of unrestricted resources. A good chunk of that money comes from the state school fund formula. About 90% of the revenue in the general fund is from the state school fund formula. And the general fund is really to cover the day-to-day instruction and operations of the district. And just to remind everyone, and this is common for K-12 public school districts, but personnel costs contribute to 85% of total costs in the general fund. Next slide, please, Patty. So back on March 1st, the legislature, which is in the middle of session, proposed their framework for the initial proposed budget for the 21-23 biennium. And the proposal for the state school fund was $9.1 billion for the 21-23 biennium. And the legislature has been pretty much stuck on that number. Often progress is made to a higher number at this stage of the session, but they're still staying on that $9.1 billion level. However, K-12 advocates continue to push back on that number. And with that, our budget assumption for the state school fund for 21-22 school year will be $9.3 billion in state school funds. So the numbers in graphical form here are based, the revenue numbers are based on that $9.3 billion level. And you'll see from, this is a 2-year look based on that budget level. And in 21-22, are the expenditures of approximately $162 million exceed our revenue by approximately $8 million. So in any event, whether it's 9.1 or $9.3 billion, it's inadequate to meet our service level needs in the general fund. You'll see a similar difference in 22-23. I think it's even a little higher, probably over $8.5 million difference or deficit. And then the green line going left to right is to depict the spend down of our ending fund balance We're expected to end this year with approximately $31 million. If we spend it in a deficit fashion, we're going to spend that down to under $15 million by the end of the 2 years. So this is our current estimate. And as we put the details of the budget together in preparation for the budget committee meeting on May 19th, these numbers will refine a little bit, but these are our best estimates at this point in time. I'm going to pause for a minute to make sure there's no questions on this graph.
No questions.
Thank you. Next slide, Patty, please. We also, of course, have our student investment account resource, and this is a recurring resource funded by the corporate activity tax at the state level. And this year, we're realizing $3.2 million in this resource. And the good news is next year that the current estimate is to bump that up to $8.1 million for Tigard-Tualatin. And just to remind everyone, full funding would be at $10.1 million. So we've prioritized our uses of these dollars in 4 categories, and we'll be able to do pretty much everything through category 3 priority level. And we're hoping as this the corporate activity tax moves forward, we'll get to that full funding level in future years. Some common themes of use of these dollars for Tigard-Tualatin include equity, mental health services, social emotional learning, special education, English language learners, and class size maintenance. And we're in the middle of a 3-year plan, and we have the opportunity, if we need to make shifts in our planned resources as was submitted in our initial application last year. And we'll have to make a commitment by the end of June if we're going to do any shifting of use of these resources for 21-22. Next slide, please, Patty. We also, another resource is the high school success dollars. These have been in place for the past several years. And in the 2016 November election, Oregon voters approved ballot measure 98 that provides this dedicated resource to high school success, specifically dropout prevention, career and technical education, and college opportunity. And 15% of these dollars can be used at the middle school level, so a very small amount. So primarily these are being used at the high school level. And our current estimate is $3.2 million approximately. Next slide, please, Patty. In response to the pandemic, we've seen several rounds of resource from the federal government. I mentioned the ESSER funds. That stands for Elementary and Secondary Schools Emergency Relief Fund. Earlier this year, we received the ESSER 1 allocation, and this was just under $1.5 million, and we've pretty much spent that down completely in the current year. Some of the key uses were for our online curriculum and internet support for families, in addition to, in preparation for reopening, purchasing PPE and cleaning supplies and equipment. And then late in the 2020 calendar year, we learned that additional dollars in the form of ESSER 2 were going to be allocated. Quite a bit of a bump in that allocation to $5.7 million approximately. Those dollars can be used as same uses as ESSER 1, plus for transition back to in-person learning and recovery of learning loss, mental health services, and then ventilation systems for school buildings. And then lastly, we recently received our allocation for the ESSER 3 dollars. This is part of President Biden's American Rescue Plan. and our amount is actually brand new amount that we learned in the last few days. I think it's $12,892,000. So later in the presentation, we'll share how what the possible uses of those dollars are, and then Dr. Riki Smith's going to share a timeline of how those dollars could be used over multiple years. ESSER 2 can be used through September of 2023, and ESSER 3 through September of 2024. Next slide, please, Patty. We also received notice that we would be receiving an allocation from the state. State leaders have allocated some state budget money to summer programming and childcare. And Tigard-Tualatin's allocations include $1.8 million for K-8 enrichment programs, $1.5 million for high school academic programs specific to credit recovery. And then we also have ability to access $900,000 for childcare for those students that are participating in these programs. So this was an excellent windfall for the district to use these dollars first, perhaps, for our summer program. And then the dollars require a 25% match. So the thinking is we would use one of our ESSER funds to provide those matching dollars for this upcoming summer. Next slide, please. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Director Unn, and she's going to give an overview of the Student Success Act, how that led to the student investment account, and how those dollars are making a difference for Tigard-Tualatin. So Director Unn.
Thank you, Director Moore. Good evening, everyone. I wanted to take a moment to share a little bit about the Student Success Act and the advocacy work from our legislators and our partners in education to advocate for the investment of $2 billion. And with that, the investment of $1 billion to the Students Investment Account, the Early Learning Account, and statewide education initiatives. At that time, our legislators did a tour of our various schools and listened to students and communities to highlight what were the needs and the gaps necessary for investment to ensure we were serving our students. So we wanted to share a little bit about how we took that work on regarding community outreach and engagement and partnership. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So during that last year, we had gone through a community engagement process where we convened and met with our community members and asked about our 3 priorities, as well as vetting if those 3 priorities of SEL, coachly and community responsive teaching and learning, as well as our investment on human capital and talent were part of those investment priorities. We had gotten feedback and worked on our continuous improvement plan and filed for the grant application. And we brought that forth again, as you see here, with the community engagement to ensure that we heard from our communities on what was important to them. And at that time, our community highlighted those things that Director Moore had indicated earlier: investments in equity, SEL, and mental health supports. And those investments proved to be very important for us, as we know, as we went into COVID. Next slide, please. So with that, a quick reminder of what the student investment account process looked like in what we talked about regarding community engagement and partnership. And through the work that those in our community participated in, we were able to highlight and invest in those things that Director Moore had highlighted, supports for our students who are furthest from opportunity, as well as supporting mental and behavioral health needs. And as I said earlier, we didn't anticipate how that community work and bringing forth the insights from our community was so important, as those investments in equity helped stand up our basic needs team and meet the needs of our community. And so with that, we wanted to share some of those voices. And I want to welcome our controller, Sarah Muravzadeh, to help me read some of those stories and some of those insights from our community. Next slide, please.
We don't have childcare. Our oldest takes care of our younger siblings and misses school.
My friend got COVID and my teachers didn't know how to accommodate them.
I am worried about the mental health of my child.
We saw loss of enrollment.
We are worried about the impact of the trauma of COVID going into reopening and our MTSS process.
My hours were cut. Now we are 4 months behind on rent.
Comprehensive online learning has been really good for me. I had anxiety. My teachers check on me more.
I feel socially isolated. My peers seem depressed.
I worry about my peers. They seem very disengaged with online school.
I'm frustrated by this situation.
This really highlighted the inequities in our institutions.
If I go back to school, I worry about spreading COVID to my family.
I lost family members to COVID.
Interrupted our family routines and lifestyle.
I will not send my kids back. Our family is not vaccinated.
So as you can see, we heard a lot from our community members, including our staff, students, families, about the impact of COVID. And with the investments that we made with SIA funds, we were able to help mitigate some of the issues that were highlighted here. And as Dr. Suriki Smith will highlight, with the esser funds, we can see the need is great in our community. Dr. Suriki Smith.
Thank you, Director. And Patty, next slides. This arrow here with the dots basically graphically represents our use of the ESSER 2 and the ESSER 3 funds out into the summer of 2024. The purpose here is to provide as many opportunities for our students to be with meaningful adults without long breaks. So utilizing these dollars and the state dollars that Director Moore shared relative to K-8 enrichment, 9-12 credit recovery and childcare this coming summer. The goal here is to provide meaningful opportunities for students, both in the summer and then again in the school year. So this year, the summer of 2021, we will offer 4 weeks of enrichment and credit recovery opportunities for students. All students are welcome at any one of our schools where we will have programming this summer. It will include transportation, it will include breakfast and lunch, and it will include a choice of activities for your student to engage in. And then after about a 4-week break, we will begin the 21-22 school year. That'll start September 8th. And then we will repeat the summer school experience in the summer of 22. And again, a break of about 3 weeks between the end of the school year to the beginning of the next one. And next year and all the years forward, unless there is some major concern, we will return to full brick and mortar instruction 5 days a week, full days of instruction, as we did pre-COVID. And we are in the process of standing up an online school that is its own entity for those who wish to continue their instruction online. In the school year 22-23, we will be adding an additional week of school thanks to the ESSER funds. And so school will begin the week before Labor Day, which will allow us 5 additional days of instruction. And then again, about a 3-week break, 4 weeks of summer school in the summer of 2023, and then 4 weeks later to begin again another extended school year where we will start before Labor Day to add an additional 5 days of full in-person, full day, full week instruction, and then finish out the ESSER funds potentially with a summer school the summer of 2024. So you can see between the summer school and between the school calendar, students will have the opportunity to receive between 40 to 41 weeks of interaction and instruction with their teachers and with meaningful adults throughout the school year. And we appreciate the funding that we have received from the federal government to allow us to address not just the impacts of COVID on student learning, but the impacts socially, emotionally, and in terms of mental health in our students as well. Director Moore?
Thank you, Dr. Riki Smith. Next slide, please, Patty. So these next couple slides are the allowable uses as provided by the Department of Education at the federal level. I'm not going to read through all of them. What I will share is today we finalized how we might use, I shouldn't say final because it seems like the more things stay the same, the more they change. But we came up with a plan, a multi-year plan going forward on how the ESSER $2 and $3 might be used. And you saw some of them on the graphic or the timeline that Dr. Riki Smith just went over, but the big ones, of course, are the calendar expansion. That's a costly but a worthwhile investment. And then we also, you'll see how it says provide school meals regardless of educational setting. We'll have some dollars set aside to meet the financial needs of our food service fund, because since we've been in comprehensive distance learning during the pandemic and we haven't had all kids in school, it's hard to serve meals at the maximum capacity level. So the number of meals drive the amount of revenue we get from the federal government for the program. So one way we can backfill that, and this is common with districts around us, also is use of the ESSER dollars to fill in that gap. We also talked about using committing to anytime a position is being hired with these dollars. For instance, we had a proposal to have health room attendants in our schools because we don't have nurses in each of our schools. And principals and staff are finding out that it's necessary to have that extra adult to attend to kids' health and wellness needs. And so that would be something we wouldn't see as a long-term need, a reminder for everyone, these dollars are one time. We're going to receive them over the next couple, 3 years. But after that, there's no assurance they will continue. So our initial goal is to use those dollars on one-time needs. And that's an example of using it for a position that would be for a 2-year period and help the schools attend to those health and wellness needs of the students as they're coming back in to either hybrid or full in-person learning. So next slide, please. Patty, you can see the continuation of appropriate uses of the dollars, supporting equitable access to effective use of technology for teaching and learning, addressing resource inequities, support educator and staff well-being. So you'll see as we publicize our actual use of the dollars, we'll have that outlined in the publicized budget document, and at least for the 21-22 year, and most of the proposed uses in 21-22 would roll over to 22-23. And at that point, we're kind of treating these dollars as used for pilot needs, kind of like how that I mentioned the student health room attendants. Perhaps after 2 years, maybe the dollars go away, but we decide we want to continue doing something that we've been doing the last 2 years, but the dollars are going away. Perhaps we can, maybe our SIA funds at that point will be a higher level. We could perhaps use those, or the general fund recovers to higher levels so that we could continue doing those pilot projects. Any questions on that? I'm going to pause for a second to make sure there's no questions.
No questions in the chat, Director Moore?
Thank you, Director Rose. Next slide, please, Patty. So we mentioned our community budget work group process, and out of that typically comes proposals from directors or teams related to what are some strategic investments we'd like to see in the budget going forward. Over the period of the last year or more, we had Board Chair Maureen Wolf and Vice Chair Ben Bowman meeting with a group of students. So true indication of student voice in action in our district. And the student group, or actually a couple different groups, because we had one group last school year, and then many of those group members exited out as seniors, and we had a new group this year. But the board members continue meeting with the students, and the proposal that was brought, or the barrier or issue that was brought forward a year ago, was the barriers that are in place and burdens that are in place for students that are trying to access extracurricular activities, including athletics and activities. This culminated into a proposal to the community budget work group this year, and a 3-part proposal. And the first was to eliminate pay-to-play fees. So the actual dollars budgeted in the general fund as a revenue through the current year budget is $255 for pay-to-play fees. So the proposal would be to eliminate pay-to-play fees. First part of the proposal. The second part of the proposal is that it recognizes another barrier for students is getting to their activities. You know, even if they're going home after school and they have to come back for practice or the actual activity, some kids just can't get back to school to participate. So the students brilliantly proposed a transportation resource for students to help eliminate that barrier. The good news is, if we pay for that out of the general fund in the form of their proposal of $100,000, the net cost to us is actually only $30,000, because for each home to school dollar we spend, we get a 70% reimbursement from the state school fund formula. So really a minor investment as far as the district's concerned there. And then the third part of the proposed investment is to fund, to help fund clubs and fine arts. And this would be a supplement to fundraising, but also relieve some of the burden on students to help fundraise for their activities. And these dollars would actually be resourced out of the student investment account. And so overall, we're looking at, if we consider the net cost of the transportation, we're looking at about $385,000 total investment for this. So we have this planned in the budget areas indicated, general fund and SIA. So any questions? Stop there for a second to make sure there's no clarifications needed on the proposal and how we're handling this in the budget being proposed for next year.
No questions.
Thank you, Director Rose. We also, if we go to the next slide, Patty, we also had a proposal from our early learning team in preparation for some real nice expansion of the program, including opening of the new early learning center over at the old Templeton Core elementary building. And dollars, of course, are needed to operate the facility. And I'll go through this in the different categories of proposed investment. You know, the hope is to have somebody to run the office, or be the person to greet the public and the parents and families as they bring their children into the center. And then, of course, we need support to clean and maintain the building. So a total investment of just over $121,000. We've had, in partnership with the ESD the last several years, we've had early childhood centers operated off-site, off-campus, one in Beaverton. The plan would move that to the early learning center, that particular classroom. And to up the class sizes, we need additional IA support to the tune of almost $87,000. And then also with a total of 4 classrooms at the early learning center, we would make 2 of those Head Start classrooms, so they'd be moving to the new center from Metzger and Alberta Ryder. And then the 4th classroom would remain empty in preparation to open in a future year. And the last, or the next part of the change or shift to the early learning program is to move the Tualatin Early Childhood Center, which is also off-site currently, to Tualatin Elementary. So all these centers that are being moved to on our campuses would make it more likely that you know, children would be going to their neighborhood school for their early childhood experience. And of course, similar to the Beaverton classroom shift, we would need extra IA support to reduce those, increase those class sizes. I think I said that backwards before, but it's to increase the class sizes. Next slide, Patty, to round out the investments. The other big shift is to convert our current high school preschool programs, which have been taught by a classified individual. We would make those part of the district pre-K program. And so that would involve hiring for each of the 2 high school programs, a licensed teacher to lead those programs. And then we would also need IA support at each of those programs. And then also a big add to the overall program is to provide transportation to our families and early learners to these different sites that we've discussed. And then finally, program support in the form of a halftime instructional coach, and then materials and supplies for the program. Any questions on this investment? Again, this is strictly out of the general fund. I think the total is about 791,000 of all those investment elements.
No questions in the chat.
Thank you. Next slide, Patty, please. Any final discussion or Q&A of those that are in the Zoom meeting? Next slide, Patty, please. So our next steps, of course, are our formal budget committee meeting on May 19th, and the budget committee will consider budget approval and determine at that time if they need to have future meetings the following week or the following 2 weeks. And the budget committee is also charged, like I said, with approving the tax levies and the tax amounts for debt service. And if the budget's approved by the committee, it goes forth to the board, and the board will hear a budget hearing aligned with the regular board meeting on June 28th and take any public comment, as will the budget committee on May 19th. Public comment's a big piece, and we always by law, we have to provide that opportunity for the community and patrons to give feedback and ask not ask questions, but provide that input on the current status of the proposed or the approved budget. And then, of course, the hope is, since that's the last board meeting of the year, that the board adopts the budget, and that would complete our budget process. Dr. Riki Smith, you'd like to close us out unless we have any last minute questions?
So Director Rose, any last questions?
There are none.
Patty, if you could advance one more slide, please. Thank you. I want to say thank you to all who are present here as participants this evening, and certainly to those of you who have taken the opportunity to view the live stream on YouTube. We certainly look forward to welcoming you if you wish to share public comments here in the upcoming board meetings relative to the budget. And I want to say thank you to this entire team that has put in countless hours, especially Director Moore and Sarah Marabzadeh, who has, this is her first year doing a full budget cycle and has done an outstanding job, to Director Rose and to Director Un, relative to the engagement, certainly to our board chair, Maureen Wolf, our vice chair, Ben Bowman, for their work with our students, and to the other directors who have continuously and faithfully advocated and supported our work throughout this year, as they have done in previous years. And so with that, I thank you all, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and we hope to see you soon at a board meeting. Have a great evening.